Hello, everyone. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax.
So this happened all the way back in the late 1990s when I was a college sophomore. Me and the girl I was dating at the time had been going steady for about 8 months, and since she was my first real girlfriend, my mom was pretty keen to meet her. And what better time than the holidays to introduce her to the folks? During the week before Christmas, my mom's family traditionally held quite a large gathering up at my uncle's place over in Sandy, in my home state of Oregon. Pretty much all my extended family head out there year after year from all over the Portland area, and since they've gotten word that I was bringing my girlfriend, the hype to meet her was huge. I won't lie, I was kind of nervous that they'd embarrass me in front of her, but that anxiety was totally misplaced. She got along really well with all of them, and despite some playful humiliation when a cousin of mine told her the story of how I literally peed my pants at the Haunted Mansion ride when I was a kid, they were a credit to me. And when it came to driving her back home, she seemed to be more into me than ever. We'd agreed to drive back down to Eugene at like 7 p.m. so I wouldn't be too tired driving back. But since we had such a good time, we stayed way later than we had planned to, and didn't get on the road until about 10:30 p.m. that evening. In the hopes of making the journey a little faster, I ended up taking the OR211 instead of just sticking to the I-5S for the whole drive. Annoyingly, this didn't quite actually make the journey any faster, but point being, the OR211 was pretty much surrounded by farms or these huge swaths of dense pine forest. So as you can imagine, big stretches of it aren't lit very well at all, and for some parts of the drive, we were moving through complete darkness, saved only by our car's headlights. But honestly, I wasn't all worried about it. I was pretty good at reading a map, and once I was back on the I-5, a road I knew pretty well, I figured everything would be all good. So we're just cruising along, in high spirits, talking about how goofy some of my family were, but generally my girlfriend was singing their praises and telling how she couldn't wait to meet them again. It's right around then that we hit a section of the highway that descends down this big old hill, heading up to the bridge crossing over Deep Creek. There, the highway is sandwiched by some of the densest forests you've ever likely seen, and there is absolutely nothing lighting up the highway. It's the only thing we can see from the front seats of the cars, like maybe 20 or 30 feet that our headlights are illuminating, and pretty much nothing else. But like I said, we're in high spirits, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Right as the highway was starting to level off, something darts across the front of us so fast and so suddenly that I barely missed smashing into it. I brake so hard that I almost gave the pair of us whiplash. Then, when we're stopped, both me and my girlfriend are in a complete frenzy of, "Oh God, did you see that? What was that?" There are plenty of deer in that area of Oregon, plenty of coyotes too, but the thing that ran out in front of us was way too big to be a coyote, and something about the way it moved gave me this gut feeling that it wasn't a deer either. The shape was just way too slender, almost like whatever was out there had moved on 2 legs, not 4. Now next thing, I know how completely dumb this sounds in retrospect, but my curiosity just got the better of me and I decided I wanted to investigate. So again, this was also incredibly dumb. I turned the car like 90 degrees in the highway so I could point our headlights into the woods. Yes, this could have caused a horrible accident if another car had come along at the same time I was doing this, but I don't think I was thinking straight at the time. You see, as a kid growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I've heard a lot of stories about Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and I'd be lying if I said that they didn't capture my imagination. No, I'm not saying that I thought I'd caught a glimpse of Gigantopithecus or anything. I know the stories are mostly exactly that, just stories, but a part of me just wanted to be sure. So like I said, I turned the car 90 degrees, turned on the high beams, and stepped out of the driver's side and onto the highway. I stare off into the trees for a minute or two, but I don't see a thing. Nothing is moving out there, and the whole scene was as quiet as the grave. But as I'm looking, I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach, and start to feel as if though I'd made a huge error of judgment. It was one of the most intensely terrifying feelings I'd ever felt in my entire life, a feeling like I was being watched by something predatory. I know it's a huge cliche, and the whole "I felt like I was being watched" thing is such a tired old trope, but I don't really know any other way to phrase it. My heart was pounding. The hairs on the back of my neck are standing on end, and my gut just turned to ice. So without turning my back to the woods, where I expected the danger to come from, I started edging back towards the car. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, I practically jump out of my skin when I hear the car's horn letting off one long, excruciatingly loud, extended blast. I mean, it scared me so bad that I almost straight up peed my pants, Haunted Mansion style. My first thought was that my girlfriend had ended up leaning on the horn as she climbed over into the driver's seat for some reason, because she'd done that once or twice before. But as I turn back around, I can see she's still on the passenger side, but that she's actually leaning over to push the horn in what was evidently a frenzied attempt to get my attention. I run back to the car and ask her if she's okay, but she doesn't say a single word to me. She just points off to a spot about 50 feet away from where we parked. I spin my head around to see what she's pointing at, and that's when I see it. What was, without a shadow of a doubt, the thing that had run in front of our car just a few minutes prior. Lit up by the residual light of our high beams, what I saw was really obviously a man, but he was covered in animal furs. What looked like a mishmash of deer skins, bear skins, and elk skins, and on his head, secured in a way I'm not even sure of, were these antlers. At the time, because of how closely it was to the holidays, I remember the words "reindeer man" just flashed into my mind. Maybe in the naive hope that the dude was dressed that way out of some misdirected festive spirit. But he certainly didn't seem in any kind of festive spirit, not in the least bit. Like I couldn't see his eyes because of the weird kind of head covering he had on, but I could see his mouth, and at first he kind of looked like he was giving us a smile. Only as I looked, I could see it wasn't a smile at all. This guy was just baring his teeth to us, like the way chimps do as some kind of warning. After that, he turned and walked off into the forest, never to be seen again. Obviously, right after that, me and my girlfriend just got out of there and got back onto the roads towards the I-5. It took us both a while to calm our nerves, but my girlfriend was particularly shaken up, and that's because she'd seen something that I hadn't. And as we drove on, she explained exactly what that was. While I'd been staring off into the woods, looking for Sasquatch or whatever, she'd noticed him out of her peripheral vision, but was basically frozen in fear for a moment or two as she watched him walking slowly towards me. Or rather, walking isn't the right word. From how she described it, this guy was stalking, the way a hunter might stalk a deer. The way she puts it, she had to summon up pretty much all of her courage to be able to lean over and honk the horn the way she did. Then when Reindeer Man had heard the honking, he'd backed off a little before I saw him, and like I said, he kind of just froze in place before disappearing. I did a fair amount of online research when I got home to try and find out if anyone else had any run-ins with this guy, but there was absolutely nothing online about him. There are plenty of crazy survivalist types up here in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm guessing he was one of those, but they tend to be pretty open about their existence, sometimes even advertise themselves as militiamen or whatever, whereas the Reindeer Man seemed like he was living completely off the grid. I don't live in Oregon anymore. Me and my girlfriend during the encounter broke up at the end of college, but when we were still together and I happened to be driving down towards Eugene, I always avoided the stretch of highway that I saw the Reindeer Man on. I've told this story a lot over the years, and some people honestly just think I'm making it up as like a campfire tale or something. But it's not a tale. It's not made up. And it's definitely not just intended to be some dumb spoopy story. It's most definitely a warning to anyone traveling on that road at night, because if my girlfriend wasn't with me when he ran out in front of the car, if she wasn't there to spot him before he crept up on me, only to scare him off with a blast of the horn, I honestly might not be here to warn you guys. So please, this holiday season, drive careful, drive slow, and do not stop for any reason on dark, deserted stretches of forest highway. During college Christmas break of 2016, I had traveled all the way back to Pennsylvania from California to spend the holidays with my parents. It was kind of weird going from being a mostly independent college kid in a place that hardly ever gets cold to going back to living in my childhood bedroom in a state that becomes a legit winter wonderland around December and January. But I love my mom and dad, and I don't care how much the flight costs. There was no way I was going to spend the holidays alone in Cali. So anyway, my old room is on the second floor of the house, directly above the sliding door that heads out onto the decking in our backyard. It's a really heavy door, so anytime someone opens or closes it, it rumbles right up into my bedroom. This was in a house that was built back in the 50s too, so as you can imagine, the whole place has a lot of creaks and groans to it, but is otherwise pretty sturdy. I should also add at this point that part of the town that my parents live at is pretty safe, with a relatively low crime rate, especially to that of nearby Philly. The most intrusive calls they ever got tended to be from magazine salespeople and the odd Jehovah's Witnesses, and after my dad insisted on debating scripture with them, they stopped calling altogether. Point being, they never had anything remotely close to any kind of break-in or home invasion for the entire time they were living in that property. Next thing is a brief confession from myself here. I picked up a pretty horrible smoking habit during my freshman year of college, so whenever my parents went to bed, I tended to stay up late playing Civ on my laptop, sitting next to my open bedroom window while I smoked and drank tumblers of scotch that I'd pilfered from my dad's liquor cabinet. After midnight, I'd have my window open from anything of 30 minutes to 2 hours. I mean, it would purely depend on how cold it was outside or how tired I was, but I generally let the room air out before spraying some air freshener so that the tobacco smell didn't cling to anything too bad. I also had to use headphones to watch TV and listen to music so it wouldn't wake my mom and dad up. But I tend to only ever use one earphone so I could keep an ear out for anyone coming down the hallway, since they really wouldn't be happy if they found I was smoking in the house. So one night, I was in my usual routine of conquering the known world in an online multiplayer game of Civ when our house alarm suddenly starts blaring. I don't think I'd heard that thing since I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I had completely forgotten about how loud it was. So hearing it had me practically filling my underwear from being frightened out of my skin. Point being, everyone in the house is now wide awake and ready to head off whatever is about to go down. Now my priorities might sound way off here, but initially my big worry wasn't so much that something bad might be happening, like a home invasion or something like that. It was more like me being terrified that my parents were about to realize I'd been smoking and stealing booze from them. I was 20 years old at the time, technically underage, and my parents were old-fashioned types, real sticklers for the rules. If they found out what I'd been doing, there'd be drama, and lots of it. But somehow, when my dad stuck his head around my door all bleary-eyed to make sure he knew where I was, he didn't seem to smell anything. I don't know whether this was because he was too tired and freaked out about the alarms to notice, or that he noticed and actually just didn't care, but either way, he told me to go into their bedroom and stay with my mom until he could give us the all-clear. So my dad goes downstairs, I'm assuming with pistol in hand, and gets to work clearing the house, as well as checking the front and backyards to make sure that there's no one hiding in the darker areas out there. He comes back up, tells me and my mom he couldn't find anything and it was probably just a false alarm, and then we all head back to bed. Or rather, they went back to bed. I just went back to being a diplomatic genius on Civ 6. About an hour goes by and I start getting pretty tired, so I get up to close my bedroom window before heading to bed when the alarm goes off again. Once again, my dad goes downstairs, does a sweep of the grounds floor and the yards, then comes back to tell me not to worry and that he figured it was just the wind or something. I mean, it had been a pretty windy night, which honestly suited me because it meant the breeze aired my room out. Like I said, it was an old house, so it wasn't out of the question that the wind could have rattled the doors or windows and set the alarm off. The point being that both me and my dad were chill about the alarm going off. neither of us thought there was anything to worry about. So the next morning at breakfast, my dad is going through the alarm system's app on his iPhone, checking out some of the data readouts from the night before. All of a sudden, he's all like, "Okay, that's weird. Apparently the back sliding doors were opened 14 times last night." Number one, I was impressed the alarm system was so sophisticated that it could feed him that kind of info. I guess he shelled out big boy cash for that thing. But number two, how could it have been opened that many times? Then I'm not kidding, like 5 to 10 minutes later, there's a knock at our front door, and it's the neighbor guy from the house down the street. He asked us if we had any intruders over the previous night, and we tell him no, or that at least we didn't think so. It's then that he tells us that he actually caught someone on a security camera trying to break into his house, that the dude had tried to jimmy a lock or something before looking right up into the camera before getting spooked and bailing. We assumed that this is about the time that he moved on to our house, then kept at it when he realized it was the weaker target. That seriously freaked me out. The whole time I'd been sitting there, innocently playing games, sipping stolen scotch, there had been a guy trying to get into our house, maybe only 6 or 7 feet below me. If I'd have bothered to look out the window at any point and directly downward, I'd have locked eyes with the guy. He must have smelled my cigarette smoke, known someone was home, and it just didn't bother him in the least bit. He was more than prepared to face off with someone, although apparently not when he'd seen my dad with his pistol, sweeping the house and yards in the dark. I've always liked a scary story or a good horror film. Ghosts, vampires, werewolves, they're my jam. I've never found, like, serial killers or whatever to be that scary, though. Like, I didn't think that the human element to the horror was particularly potent. After that night, though, that all changed. It struck me how evil and predatory human beings can really be. How that guy had been creeping around in our backyard for basically hours right under my nose, and I'd had absolutely no clue he was there. It's how he managed to just disappear when the alarm went off, too, and how he had the balls to come back once we'd all gone back to bed. I mean, he was like a ghost or something, just vanishing into the darkness. I mean, think about it. My dad had checked out the backyard, tried to make sure that there was no one hanging around, hiding out in the dark spots underneath the trees, and there had been. There had been someone there, just watching my dad walking around in his slippers or whatever he had on, just waiting for him to call off the search before creeping back up towards the house. Just thinking about it now gives me shivers. And now that I'm back in Cali writing this, I always make sure that all the windows and doors in my dorm are locked, and that I double or triple check whenever I think something bad is about to go down or whatever. Because sometimes it seems you'll never know if someone is just lurking in the shadows until it's way, way too late. I've worked as a mall Santa for the past few Christmases now. I'm only 33, but thanks to my complete lack of exercise routine, I definitely have the figure for it. And once I have the beard and the wig and hat combo going, there's basically no telling the difference between me and a 60-year-old dude. Mall Santa work can be tough for a few different reasons. Number one, the hours are really long and the pay can be really terrible depending on which mall you manage to get employed by. Number two, the kids can be little monsters, and their parents can be just as terrible on occasion too. But the reason I'm actually considering skipping the entire thing this year and having something of a budget Christmas is that you get some seriously disturbing things happening from time to time. I mean, the kind of things that keep you up at night, even after a long, exhausting shift. However, the worst thing that's ever happened to me as a mall Santa was actually nothing to do with kids, parents, or terrible pay and hours, and I'm sure you'll see why after I tell the story. So every year, usually when the malls are quietest during weekday mornings, we get specially organized visits from special needs kids or adults with learning disabilities who are bussed in from the surrounding areas. Pretty much every other mall Santa I've spoken to about this agrees that it can be one of the most rewarding parts of the job, and that the adults with learning difficulties are often even more excited about the prospect of meeting Santa than some of the kids are. Literally the only downside is that some of them are so heavy that my thighs hurt after having like 50 in a row sit on my lap, but other than that, it's honestly one of the best parts of the job. Last year, I'm in the middle of one of the special sessions when I get this girl coming up and sitting on my lap. I say girl, but she was legitimately a grown woman, looking like she was in her mid-30s or something, but she had the mental age of about 9 or 10, all smiles and giggles, way shy about meeting Santa again. It was cute as all get out, but the interaction was not so cute, and turned that way pretty fast. So like I said, she's all giggles and smiles as she comes up to sit on my lap, and I give her the usual spiel, asking her name, how old she is, if she's excited for Christmas and all that stuff. Then, when it comes to asking her what she wants me to bring her on Christmas Eve, she starts thinking about it, smiling at first before she suddenly gets super serious with a touch of sadness. I'm asking her if she's okay, what the problem is, and she's like shaking her head, acting like she doesn't want to tell me anything. I take the time and explaining that no matter what she asks for, I'll try my very, very best to bring it to her, no matter how big or small it is, that Santa always tries his best to bring good little girls and boys what they ask for on Christmas. She takes a moment. Then the exchange goes a little something like this. You mean it, Santa? You can get me anything I want for Christmas? Anything. Anything you want. Just tell me and I'll do my best. Okay, well. And at this point she lowers her voice to a whisper and leans into my ear. I want my boyfriend to stop hitting me. Can you make that happen? I was sort of dumbstruck for a second. Like all of the things I thought she was going to ask, that would most definitely not have topped the list. I remember just nodding at first, trying to find the words, then being like, I'll make that happen for you, sure, no problem. She was so happy to hear that I'd fix it for her, and gave me the biggest hug I think I'd ever received while working as a mall Santa. I had to put on a huge smile, and of all the times I've had to fake being jolly and merry, that time with her was the hardest. But I just felt numb, like completely broken by what I'd heard, and I just tried my best to get through the rest of the session without bursting into tears. I remember all these thoughts rushing through my head, terrifying ideas of institutional abuse. She said boyfriend, and that made it extra creepy. Like, sure, it could have been just another guy in her care group or something, another adult with learning difficulties who she'd hooked up with somehow, but there was nothing to say that it wasn't a member of her care team that was, like, abusing her, in a completely different sense, too. Not just physically, but, well, you catch my drift. So when the session was over, I approached the member of the care team that had organized the trip and had accompanied them to the mall. I didn't let anything slip. I just told them how great I thought the session had gone and asked a few details about the group that had organized them. As it turned out, they were all from the same care home type thing, so I made a note of the name of the place as well as the name of the girl that was apparently being abused. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just kept picturing some evil monster abusing that poor girl, taking advantage of their position to put some poor special needs woman through torture, then telling her that she'd be killed if she ever breathed a word of it to anyone. And here's where stuff starts getting even more intense. Now, I could have just called 911 with the info I had at hand, registered a general complaint, and then heard nothing back about it. But a buddy of mine had a cousin with the local police department, and not just some gumshoe beat cop either. They were a detective. It took some convincing, but I convinced my buddy to pass along their cell phone numbers so I could get in touch with the dude personally. It took a little while, but I managed to get through to the guy. He sounded pretty skeptical at first and seemed kind of irritated that his cousin had even given me his number, but once I explained what the issue was, his tone changed completely. Now, I didn't find this out until way later from my friend, but his cousin had a special needs daughter who was probably going to have to either live with them for the rest of their life or was going to head into a group home at some point so she could have some measure of independence. So when I explained the situation with the special needs girl I met as a mall Santa, it obviously hit the guy right in the feels as the topic was so close to home. The detective tells me that he'll look into it, thanks me for letting him know. I get him to promise to tell me if anything comes of it, and he says yes, and we hang up. And that was the last I heard of it for like a month. Then after maybe 5 or 6 weeks, I'd almost forgotten about the whole thing. Christmas was over, the mall Santa job was way behind me, and I was back to working my regular hours as a self-employed mechanic. Then I get a call from a number that seems vaguely familiar, although I wasn't quite sure why. Turns out it was my buddy's detective cousin, who reminded me of the tip that I'd given him about the care company. Of course I remembered, but by that time I really didn't think anything would come of it, but oh, how wrong I was. The detective thanks me for the information, and although he told me he couldn't say too much, he told me to keep an eye out on local media outlets. The next thing I know, it's all over the local papers that there's been a misconduct scandal involving a local care company. I picked up a copy and read the story, only to find out that it's the very same one I had reported. The long and short of it is that the cops had uncovered endemic levels of abuse in the company, stuff that varied from financial discrepancies to straight-up physical abuse, and sickeningly enough, there was even cases of care workers taking advantage of mentally disabled females in ways that were seriously inappropriate. There were numerous arrests, with some of the sleazier and violent criminals looking like they were going to get years in prison for how long they so cruelly taken advantage of some of the most vulnerable people in society. It made me sick to my stomach to read about how some people could bring themselves to do something like that. But it was stopped, and I felt incredible that I'd actually managed to be a part of the chain of events that brought the whole thing crashing down. I just hoped that that poor girl, who was obviously pretty traumatized by what was happening to her, and just not being able to understand why it was happening either, found some measure of peace after it. And in a way, Santa did kind of bring her exactly what she wanted, even if it wasn't on Christmas Day, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is a thought that never fails to make me tear up. This story happened a long time ago when I was about 7. I don't think I have ever told it to anyone, and it was a very short incident, but it's been in the back of my mind ever since. Typically, my cousins would babysit me and my sister during summer and winter breaks. They were about 10 years older than us, maybe 15 to 17 at the time. One day, about a week before Christmas, they took us to the mall to do some shopping. This is one of the largest malls in my area, and it was usually always very crowded, even more so during Christmas time. The day went fine, and they even bought me a small ball which I started playing around with by bouncing it on the floor and catching it as I walked. Because of this, I was walking behind them, distracted in my own world. After we had finished shopping, we exited through the main doors, which were the most crowded, and just as we were crossing the street to go into the parking lot, some guy, my guess would be about 40+ years old, grabbed me by the hand and started pulling me to a van right across the street. I remember the van very clearly. It was one of those conversion vans popular in the 90s with drapes on the window, red with thin gray stripes running through the sides, and van doors. One of the back seat doors was open and you could see a woman sitting on the driver's seat. She was about the same age as the guy, and you can tell that the engine was running. At the time, I didn't really know what was going on. I just thought it was weird in a sort of funny kind of way. Why is this guy grabbing me? As I remembered, I thought he just got confused and grabbed me by accident, thinking I was his son or something. So I shouted my cousin's name, and she quickly looked my way. She was just a few steps ahead, and as soon as she sees me, she runs to me, quickly grabs my arm with both hands, and starts shouting as loud as she can. It wasn't until I saw her freak-out face that I realized that something bad was happening. As soon as she grabbed me, the guy just lets go, gets in the van, and they drive away. They didn't really tell the cop or call mall security. They were teens, so my guess is that they didn't really know what to do. They were just happy nothing happened. As I said, this was a very crowded day. As I got older and reflected more on what happened that day, I would understand more and more the severity of the situation. I wondered what would have happened if my cousin hadn't heard me calling her name within all that noise and multitude that was crossing the street with us. I wasn't even shouting out at the top of my lungs. I just called out her name rather calmly. So I was very lucky that day. But later that year, a kid was kidnapped in a local park. It was a very famous case that made headlines all around the county. They never found the kid, and I've always wondered if it could have been the same guy. My grandfather suffered from Alzheimer's disease and passed away 2 days before Thanksgiving. My grandmother is now living alone, so my mom has spent a lot of time over there keeping her company and helping her out around the house. She went to her house on Christmas to go with my grandmother to church before the rest of the family got there, and while my grandmother was getting ready, my mom was in the kitchen on her phone checking Facebook. Out of nowhere, this old Christmas music box in one of the bedrooms started playing by itself. It was the very last part of the melody to Silent Night, Sleep in Heavenly Peace. It played that one line at normal speed and just stopped before it could loop. I'm a skeptic, and no music boxes can do this for various reasons, but hearing that it only played that one line makes me want to believe that it was my grandfather letting his family know that he was at peace and no longer suffering. Just wanted to share this story because even if it's just the mechanism becoming unjammed, it gave my mom a feeling of peace and relief when it happened. Either way, the story both touched and freaked me out at the same time. Hearing that would have given me goosebumps. I'm currently 18 and my dad passed away in an accident when I was very little in 2005. A couple of years ago on Christmas, my brother, mother, and me were watching a corny Christmas movie on Netflix for the fun of it. It was the 1998 version of Jack Frost, where a father dies in an accident but comes back to life as a snowman to be with his kid. In the other side of the room we were in, my mom had an iPod that was hooked up to a speaker. Near the end of the film, there was a scene where the dad acknowledges that he has to pass on and tells his family he loves them as he starts to melt. During this exact scene, the iPod somehow turned on by itself and started playing loud music, which startled us a little. We were kind of silent for a while after that, and we've never since talked about it. I think I can only remember it happening one time other than that, which was in the middle of the night while everyone was sleeping. Maybe it's a coincidence, but it's pretty odd that it happened at that exact moment on Christmas. We've moved multiple times since his death, too, and that happened in a relatively new apartment. If it was him, it was a pretty sweet thing for him to do. Before I go into depth about this story, it's important to know that I've been dealing with depression ever since I was 12 years old, and as time passed, it's got progressively worse. It's also important to know that at the time that this happened, I was in a toxic relationship and it heavily affected my mood. On to the story. This happened in December of 2015. I was 16 years old at the time and my depression was once again taking a dip for the worst. Despite this, and despite the toxicity of my relationship at the time, I did my best to talk with my family about the holidays. I don't have the best relationship with them since I'm usually a quiet person around them, but on that month, both my parents told me something curious. The first account came from my dad. He told me that a few months before December, he had been driving home at around 8 p.m., so everything was dark, and the streets were barely lit with lampposts. The neighborhood I live in is a quiet one, but we have very few lampposts in our street, so walking outside at night can feel really creepy. There are neighbors who own dogs, large ones, but they're almost always quiet too. So my dad was driving down the street, and as he turned onto our street, he said he saw something in the middle of the road. He had trouble making out what it was, but he described it as a large black dog. He said it was really furry and that its ears were upright, but when I asked if it was just a stray dog, he looked at me wide-eyed and shook his head. He said this dog was abnormally huge, bigger than any other dog he had ever seen. Its eyes were piercing through him as he continued to drive, but as my dad came closer to the dog, it stepped out of view. My dad had never spoken about it until about a week ago, and even then he hadn't actually told me about it before. The only person he had told was my mother. My mom is very afraid of black dogs because of an incident from her childhood, so when I asked her about my dad's experience a few days after, she told me she froze slightly and admitted that she had seen it too. Her experience was very similar to that of my dad's. They were both coming home late at night. She had just come back from working out at the gym when she said she saw a huge black dog on the sidewalk. She, however, asked me if I knew if any of the neighbors had any black dogs, as I tend to walk around more and greet the neighbors' dogs if they're friendly. I told her that there was one, but it was just a black lab. It was a medium size and chubby, far from the description that my parents had given me. When I told her, she looked at me frightened and asked that I look into it. She's a very superstitious woman, while I tend to rationalize situations more. Maybe that's why this scares me so much. About a week after, she came up to me again, terrified. She asked me if I had ever looked into the black dog. I told her I had, and that I only remember the American version of the black dog, that if you see it once, it means joy, and if you see it twice, it means sorrow. I never told her about the third part, though, as I knew she would go ballistic if she knew. From what I read, if you see the dog a third time, it means death. Anyways, when I asked her why, she told me this. The day prior to her asking me, she went to a Christmas party with a few friends, and one friend had offered to help her bring back some food home, as the rest couldn't. It was soup. After her friend had helped her, she was going back to her car when she suddenly called my mom. My mom answered, and her friend was already driving away from our house, but in the middle of the conversation, she abruptly asked if we had let our dog outside. We do have a dog. She's a tiny white Maltese, and we love her to death, but we don't let her outside as she was never fully trained. My dog asked, "What dog?" To which her friend said, "There was a black dog on your doorstep. It was sniffing the door and looked like it wanted to go inside, but it was a really big dog. Was it yours?" My mom didn't want to scare her friend, so she told her that it was probably just a stray. But my mom had the feeling that it was the same black dog that she and my dad had seen. I didn't know what that meant, with the dog being on our doorstep and all, but I later put the pieces together, and here's why this scares me. On the 22nd of December, I had attempted suicide. I won't go into too much detail as to what pushed me to attempt suicide, but it did come from both depression and the state of my relationship as a whole. I was very, very close to dying and had never told anyone in my family. I don't think I ever will. When I asked her when she saw the black dog, she told me she saw it on the 21st of December. The second she told me, I felt a huge pit form in my stomach. I did my best to hide my horrified expression. I kept saying to myself that this has to be a coincidence. There is no way that that black dog had anything to do with me nearly dying. But, looking back on it now, it is a really strange coincidence. It's a full year later. I'm 17 years old and doing much better than I was last year. I only remember the story because yesterday was the 22nd of December. I still don't know what to think.
When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories, but this was the one that stood out. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train from his village to another to visit family. He had to change trains at one point, and was dropped off at what amounted to a platform in a hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station, and other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods, there was nothing there. He waited for some time, but no train came. It was winter, and it was getting colder and darker. And just about the time he started worrying about a place to stay and some food to eat, an old woman appeared. An old woman appeared out of the twilight. She asked if he was waiting for such and such train, and when he confirmed, she said it wouldn't be along until the following day. She asked if he needed a bed for the night, and offered him a meal and a room at her house, which he said was about an hour's walk from the station. Lodging with locals was more or less the standard when traveling in this part of the USSR, and my great-uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he graciously accepted her offer. He took his suitcase, and they set off together down the dark road into the forest. It was more than an hour away, more like 2, and by the time they arrived at the woman's small 2-story house, John was tired and hungry. They went inside, and the woman lit up some oil lamps and warmed up some soup. This was the first time that John was able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled to realize that the old woman was actually a man. Not wanting to pry and too tired to care, John finished up his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room with a window that contained a single bed and nothing else. He thanked her, and they said goodnight, and she closed the door. The door was then locked, leaving John in the dark. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called out to her, but she didn't answer, and he heard nothing else. Figuring that he would deal with it in the morning, and that she'd probably done it by mistake, John set his suitcase down and laid on the bed, deciding to make the best of it and get some sleep. Before he could fall asleep, though, he felt the urge to piss and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something he could pee in. He got onto his hands and knees and began to feel under the bed in the darkness, thinking that that's where the pot would be if there was one. Instead, he found a body. "Nope," Great Uncle John said, and went right to the window to see if he could exit the room. It was nailed shut. He knew that if he remained in the room, he was a dead man. But if he broke the window and tried to get out that way, there was a good chance that the old woman, and who knows who else, would hear him and come into the room before he could escape. So he did the only thing he could do. He pulled the body from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with the blanket. He then got under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs and then towards the room. The lock clicked, and the knob turned slowly. In the gloom, John saw someone moving towards the bed. He then heard several horrific and sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the bed with a large crowbar, which they then dropped onto the floor right in front of John. There was silence. Then the person left the room, and the door was shut again. The footsteps went down the stairs. John moved out from under the bed, took the crowbar, and was able to slowly pry the window open. He didn't say, but I imagine he was shitting bricks the entire time. When the window was up, he threw his suitcase out and then dove through himself, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind. He landed without too much injury and began to run into a field behind the house towards some lights in the far distance. It turned out to be the highway, with some military and transport trucks on it. John was able to hitch a ride to another village where he could catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what happened to the authorities, since at the time, in the USSR, there was a distinct chance that he would have been the one that got into trouble. He just thanked God that he managed to escape, and decided that the next time he traveled to visit relatives, he would take another way. I'm originally from Mexico. For reasons that will become very obvious, I wish to remain anonymous. I used to be involved in the Mexican cartel. I mainly transported drugs across the border into the United States. To make a long story short, I was caught and cooperated with the feds in exchange for immunity and asylum. Before I go any further, you can go ahead and label me a snitch if you want to. I don't care. I personally feel pretty good about routing out a bunch of drug-dealing murderers that work for an organization that is responsible for destroying so many of my fellow Mexicans' lives. I was forced into this life at a young age. I've always hated the cartel, and was already plotting a way to flee Mexico with my mother and 2 younger sisters. You could say that it was a good thing that I ended up getting caught. The story is not about how I got out of the cartel. It's about the closest call I ever had during my time with the cartel. This happened during the early days. It was the summer of 2005. I remember the date specifically because I had just turned 18 a day prior. Even though I was barely an adult, I was a very intimidating-looking guy. I come from a long line of very physically strong men. I've been lifting weights since I was a child. I'm an even-tempered guy, and I don't consider myself to be an aggressive person, but I will put somebody through the wall if they piss me off. It was because of my physical presence and my piece-of-shit father, who was also in the cartel, made me a target for recruitment. When I first started out, myself and 2 other guys would drive around Mexico City and collect debts and packages from people who owed money to the cartel or one of our distributors. It was on the 4th or 5th run that we ran into some trouble. There was this particular club we frequented where a lot of business was conducted. To make things simple, an exchange would go down in a back room, and we would come shortly after and collect the revenue and drop it off to our capo. So that night, we entered the club and began making our way to the back room. It was a fairly busy night for the club. This DJ from out of town was performing there, so people from all over were there to see him. To get to the back room, we had to go through the main dance floor to the opposite side of the building. There were some renovations that prevented us from using the back entrance. We got out onto the dance floor and started making our way through the crowd. When we were about halfway there, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was the barrel of a shotgun being pointed directly at me. I quickly ducked, and not a second later, I heard the gun go off. Unfortunately, an innocent girl who was standing beside me caught the bullet. She was shot at point-blank range, and I don't mean to be insensitive when I say this, but the poor girl's head was blasted apart. I remember several things happening simultaneously after the shotgun went off. All of the partygoers immediately fled the club. From my position on the ground, all I saw was a wave of moving legs. When I stood up, I saw a deserted club, my 2 co-workers with their guns drawn, cursing up a storm, and, unfortunately, the corpse of the young girl who was just shot. I assume that the shooter got away in the chaos. We quickly busted into the back office to find another bullet-ridden corpse. It was a club owner, who was our contact. We immediately fled the scene before the police showed up. I was never informed as to what happened with the club owner, and who almost took my head off with a shotgun. I was on the lowest rank of the cartel, and they kept us in the dark about a lot of things. I'm grateful that I'm no longer a part of that life. I would like to end things by saying a big fuck you to that asshole who tried to kill me and ended up shooting an innocent girl that night. And to all of those cartel members who got locked up because of me, you got what you deserved. And I'll see you in hell. I'm a 20-year-old male, and this happened to me in the winter of 2018, the day after Christmas. Me and my parents were on vacation in Maine, visiting my grandmother. As you can probably imagine, being in the state of Maine during the winter, it was freezing. We came up from Texas, so this was definitely not my climate, if you know what I mean. My parents had gone out to visit a friend who lived in the area, while me and my grandmother stayed back and watched some movies. My grandmother turned in at about 8 o'clock, and I eventually got bored of watching TV, so I decided to put on my coat and go for a walk outside. My grandmother's neighborhood has this neat stone maze, complete with angel statues and fountains. It was really cool, and something you really don't see a whole lot in neighborhoods these days. My grandmother's neighborhood was one of those 50-plus communities. I doubt you could have something like this in a neighborhood full of kids without it getting defaced with spray-painted pictures of penises or something. For me, I actually admired works of architecture like this, and was impressed by the amount of effort it must have taken to construct it. It was open from dusk till dawn. However, my grandmother told me that there was no neighborhood security during the holidays, and no one would say anything if I wanted to go through the maze after hours, so I did just that. I brought a flashlight with me, of course, and it took me about 5 minutes to reach the entrance of the maze from my grandmother's place. The maze wasn't massive, but it was big enough that you could get turned around, at least for a little bit. If I could give you guys a somewhat accurate visual of this maze, think of the maze in Resident Evil 4, where Leon had to fight off those dogs and gather puzzle pieces. That's roughly the same size as this maze. When I walked through this maze during the daytime, I would usually listen to my headphones, but something told me not to put them on that night, and it's a good thing that I followed my instincts. After I'd say it was about 10 minutes, I suddenly heard the sound of metal scraping against the stone walls. As soon as I heard the sound, alarm bells went off in my head. I froze in place and carefully listened for any other sounds. The scraping noise came again, except this time there was a deep voice that followed it.
"Abandon hope, all ye who enter here."
This sent chills down my spine, realizing that I was now in a maze at night with a possible maniac. The maze had these areas where a statue or a fountain would be. In these locations, there was shrubbery that lined the maze walls. There was just enough space between the wall and the bushes for a small person like me to hide behind. And since I didn't know the best route to exit the maze from where I was, I decided that the best course of action was to hide. I made my way into the area where a statue of David the Archangel was, and I quickly took cover behind the shrubbery that lined the walls. The streetlights located outside of the maze provided enough light for you to see your surroundings. However, it was still dark enough to obscure the details of objects and people. I feel that I needed to point that out, because from my hiding spot, I could see the corridor that I entered from. After about a minute, I watched a dark figure emerge from the shadows and make its way in front of the statue. I remember thinking how awesome it would be if the statue came to life and helped me out of this situation. But that thought quickly faded when the figure made its way directly in front of me. I could now see that it was holding something in its hands. I know that I said that you really couldn't tell any distinguishing features of objects because of the poor lighting. However, it was obvious what the figure was holding. Even in the dark, I could make out the distinct shape of a pickaxe. As the figure moved slowly through the area, I heard what I can only describe as teeth clattering. This only disturbed me even more as the dark shadow moved to the other side of the area and disappeared into the opposite corridor. After a few minutes of gathering my wits, I was reasonably sure that if I went back down the way I came, I could backtrack and make my escape. I cautiously moved out from my hiding spot to the corridor. I stopped in my tracks as I heard the sound of metal scraping again. It was coming from the opposite corridor where the figure had vanished. Before I could turn to look, I heard that same deep voice cut through the silence.
"I see you."
I turned my head to see the figure running towards me, pickaxe raised above its head. That's when I took off through the corridor and frantically made my way through the dark maze. There was no time to navigate through the maze properly, so I just had to guess my way through the labyrinth as the lunatic with the pickaxe closed in behind me. After about 5 minutes of twists and turns, I finally saw the exit. I tore through the snow-covered ground and towards the opening. Just before I crossed the threshold, I heard a loud smash coming from right behind me. I gave a quick glance to see the pickaxe lying in the snow by the entrance. What I think happened was that my pursuer saw that I was about to exit the maze and decided to heave his pickaxe at me, but missed. As soon as I was outside of my grandmother's house, I pulled out my phone and called the police. But like with most stories like this, they arrived too late. Having experienced this myself, I can tell you that this outcome does make sense. My assailant failed to capture or kill me, so I don't think that they would stick around for the police to show up. The officers took my statement and did a thorough search of the area. They also had a squad car patrolling through the neighborhood for the rest of that night. I didn't tell my parents or my grandmother what happened until the next day. I figured that there was no need to worry them that night. I consider myself to be a pretty level-headed person, and that's mainly why I chose to share my story. Situations like this are terrifying. but you have to try to keep your wits about you. If I had lost my composure in that maze, I'm pretty sure that pickaxe would have found its way into my skull.
The scariest thing that ever happened to me on Halloween was back when I was living in Liverpool for university. Halloween is always a big night for students, as is any yearly event that involves dressing up and getting absolutely wasted. But since Halloween is a really good excuse to wear considerably less clothes than usual, party-oriented students tend to get particularly excited about it. So I'm in second year at this point, living with a bunch of my student mates just off Smithton Road, which is where loads of students can get shared houses for really cheap rent. We heard that this big house party was happening just down the road from us, one of those that had its own little Facebook events page set up to keep track of invites and give people directions to the house. I remember my mates sitting around the kitchen table, all staring at the screen as they went through all the profiles of girls they said that were attending. I mean, some of them were absolutely gorgeous, so we were all definitely hyped about it. Only just a few days before Halloween, I started to feel really grim. I had the shakes. I was running to and from the toilet every half an hour to erupt from both ends, and I could barely keep any food down. This persisted for like 48 hours straight, and thankfully it had abated by Halloween itself, but I still felt way too rough to do any serious partying. The last thing I wanted was to end up browning myself in front of like half the girls at our uni. I mean, every lad wants to be a legend, don't they? But for the right reasons. So anyway, on the day of the house party, despite my mates insisting I make an appearance and throw together a costume, I had made the firm decision to stay at home and chill for the evening. As much as I felt like I'm missing out, I just didn't feel up to it. So about 7-ish, my mates are pre-drinking in the kitchen, while I'm up in my room looking to order the spiciest curry I could get my hands on, in the hopes that it would purge the rest of the sickness out of me, so I could start the following week feeling fresh again. So about the time I'm burning my face off with a little chicken vindaloo, my mates are just about to head off down to the house party for a night of debauchery. There are a few final pleas for me to join them, but these are all violently rebuked. There might have been a chance of me joining them before the curry, but afterwards, no chance. I was in a full-on food coma. So a couple of hours later, I'm just chilling on the couch and wondering why British Netflix had such a dire collection of horror films when there's a knock at our front door. My first thought is that there's been some kind of puke-related disaster and one of the lads had to come back to get a change of clothes before heading back to the house party. I mean, this wasn't entirely out of the question, since the house party was only around the corner, safe staggering distance for anyone that had drank too much too quickly. But it then occurred to me that there was a chance it could have been trick-or-treaters. Smithton has a big mix of residential and student housing, so there's also a decent chance it could have been kids looking for sweets. So to save the house getting egged, I legged it into the kitchen and grabbed a few bits from the cupboards to offer any potential trick-or-treaters. But when I answered the door, Mars bars in hand, there was no one there. Maybe I'd just taken too long grabbing sweets, or maybe it was just some knock-and-run type deal. But either way, there was no one to be seen. So I just head back inside, plonk myself down on the couch, and get back to digesting a ton of curry that I'd just eaten. A short while later, I'm still watching Netflix, about ready to doze off, when something in the corner of the living room catches my eye. You know when you're so used to looking at a certain something that just the oddest little difference catches your eye? Well, I happened to notice that there was a little less of the orange streetlights outside coming through the little crack between the curtains and the window. Like this dark shape was outside, standing at the window. I sit up all nervous, and it disappears from view, allowing me to see the orange light illuminating the street once again. Someone had been watching me. I got up, rushed to the cupboard under the stairs to grab my housemate's cricket bat, then edged toward the front door. I threw it open, ready to swing at whatever was out there, but again, there was nothing. I started to feel like I was going mental at that point, that maybe I was just exhausted from being sick for most of the week. I hadn't slept very well at all during the few days prior to Halloween, and I tried to reassure myself that maybe I was just a wee bit jumpy from being overtired. I decided it was best that I get an early night, telling myself that I'd feel much better in the morning. I did a bit of washing up, got a shower, then put on some comfy clothes to get ready for bed, but just as I do, there's another knock on the door. Only this time I can clearly hear some young-sounding voice go trick-or-treat from the other side of the door. I'd almost jumped out of my skin when I heard the door go, but the voice was weirdly reassuring. I mean, it was only trick-or-treaters, right? The worst that could happen was I got a few eggs thrown at me or some toilet paper lashed over the house. I walked downstairs, grabbed the handful of Mars bars I'd fished out of the cupboard, then opened up the front door. I was expecting to see a gaggle of school-aged kids, maybe accompanied by an adult supervising them, but there was just one smallish-looking figure stood in the pathway of our shared house. They couldn't have been any older than a teenager, but they definitely looked a little bit too old to be trick-or-treating. I don't imagine that they'd been particularly intimidating otherwise, but the mask they were wearing seriously gave me the creeps. It looked old, like it smelled like disgusting unwashed latex on the inside. I'm not even sure it was meant to be a Halloween mask at all. It was like an old man's face with these tiny black eyes and a big white smile stretching from ear to ear. I made some derisive comment to him like, "Aren't you a bit too old to be trick-or-treating?" But held the handful of Mars bars out towards him anyway. I reckoned he'd just tell me to bugger off and snatch the sweets off me and leg it down the path. But he didn't. The lad just stood there, looking at me from behind the mask, not even moving to take the chocolate bars off me. I asked him if he was all right, starting to actually get creeped out by his behavior on top of the weird old mask he was wearing. But still, he didn't say anything. There was something intensely creepy about not being able to see his actual eyes behind that mask, and the longer we stood there in silence, just staring at each other, the more I felt myself begin to tense up. Then right as I'm about to just give him an awkward goodbye and shut the door, I hear a loud noise coming from behind me. I didn't really think the situation through. I just reacted, running into the kitchen at the back of the house where the noise was coming from, just in time to see someone smash the back door open. About 3 or 4 people then pour into the kitchen, all wearing masks, some armed with bats, others with these big knives in their hands. I turn around and leg it back towards the front door, planning on running upstairs to my room where my phone was charging to bring the police. But to my absolute horror, blocking the way to the stairs was the little lad with the mask on. Only this time, he had a knife in his hand too. He'd been in on this whole thing that whole time, and as he pointed the knife in my direction, all I could do was raise my hands in this "please don't stab me" type of way. "Get on the floor," he said, in this voice that seriously sounded like he was no older than about 14. Like he legit sounded like a kid, and that scared me even more. A grown man might have the presence of mind to not hurt anyone and keep the severity of their crimes to a minimum, but a kid, I thought he might just stab me up for the fun of it. I'd heard stories about gangs all over the world making younger kids commit violence to just sort of prove themselves, and that's what had me shaking as I lay down on the carpeted floor in the hallway, face down with my hands on the back of my head. I listened as the gang just completely ransacked the house. I couldn't see exactly what they were taking, but I heard them mentioning laptops and phones a fair bit, laughing to themselves as they absolutely raided each and every room in the house. At some points I heard smashing and crashing noises as they just took it upon themselves to commit as much wanton destruction as they liked, giggling maniacally to each other as they realized they had the time and freedom to do pretty much whatever they fancied. I thought if I just lay there, keeping still and quiet, that they'd leave me alone, but that was just wishful thinking on my part. Obviously, they had to make their way through the hallway a fair few times, and when they did, they'd either literally walk all over me, which was painful enough, or they'd get in a few kicks here and there just to hear me grimace. I think the worst part of the physical abuse was when I heard one of them say, "Kick him in the balls, lad," to one of their mates. I tried to shut my legs, but they still aimed a few kicks between my thighs. Luckily, I was kind of tucked up, if you know what I mean, and there wasn't anything too delicate exposed, but still, the idea of getting my bollocks crushed under the trainer of some disgusting little thug had my heart practically jumping out of my throat. It sort of reminded me of that scene from A Clockwork Orange. They were there to rob us. That was bloody obvious, but they clearly took a great deal of joy in just being able to terrorize someone for a bit, and they seemed to get a real kick out of realizing that I wasn't from Liverpool. At some point I said something like, "Just take what you want. Please don't hurt me." And they burst out laughing. I wouldn't say I'm posh by any stretch of the imagination, but I'd definitely say I'm well more spoken than your average Scouser. They started mimicking me in these little voices, stamping on my head and kicking me. I just lay there, wishing I'd never said anything. After what seemed like forever, listening to those kids ferrying out belongings into the alley behind the house, they finally left. But not before putting one of their knives to my throat and telling me that they'd be back to cut my head off if they so much as even saw a police officer in the area. Then as quickly as they'd all appeared, they just ghosted. I waited for a long time before I found it in me to stand up, and as I tried, my knees were way shakier than I'd care to admit. I went from room to room surveying the destruction. The place was a mess. But the thing that amazed and gutted me more than anything else was the sheer amount of stuff they'd taken. God knows how they'd got it all away from the house, but they'd taken the TVs, our game consoles, audio equipment, pretty much anything electrical that wasn't nailed down. It also looked like they'd taken pretty much all our trainers and had raided our closets for any clothes that took their liking. I wanted to call the police, really did, but with what phone? I'm almost glad I got a few kicks to the head, otherwise the sense of shame and humiliation might have been too much to bear. I ended up knocking at my neighbors' houses, but unlike me, they were way too smart to answer their doors to strangers on Halloween. It was probably the single worst experience of my life up to that point. I had to just go back inside the house and sit there in the living room couch with my head in my hands, just trying not to hold back tears. It was hours before any of my drunken housemates arrived back. Before that, I think I just sort of sat there at the kitchen table, in the one room that hadn't been completely ransacked, just drinking a few tins of lager, feeling absolutely shell-shocked, until finally two of them who hadn't polled returned home. And that's about the end of it. There's no real resolution to the story. The police couldn't do anything other than take down a list of what had been stolen in the hopes that any of the laptops turned up in pawn shops, but we never heard back about anything involving that. It was weird in that house for a long while after. I used to think the other lads blamed me for what happened, for not defending the house property, but I realized that was just the trauma from that night making me doubt myself. I had nightmares for a while, a long while actually, and in the end my parents paid for a few counseling sessions to help me get through my skull that what happened that night really wasn't my fault, how it could have happened to anyone. I got past it in time, but to this day, it remains the single most terrifying event of my entire life. I grew up in rural Iowa, the kind of place where it's just cornfields for miles and miles around. It was a pretty terrible place to grow up. Like, it'll always be home to me, and I'll always have a fair amount of affection for it. Home is where the heart is, and all that nonsense, but even from the earliest age I can remember, I couldn't wait to leave. Like, put it this way, Halloween has always been my favorite holiday, but unlike the kids who trick-or-treat over in Cedar Rapids or Waterloo, who had actual neighborhoods to harvest whole sacks of candy from, we'd have to walk like a mile and a half at a time just to make it to the next house. So aside from the one year where our mom drove us over to Dyersville so we could actually get a taste of how those city kids lived, trick-or-treating just wasn't really an option for us. So a little backstory here. The last year we were allowed to go trick-or-treating, our immediate neighbor to the east, who lived like 3 miles away, basically told us to buzz off because we were getting way too big to be playing kids' games. This guy has begrudgingly given us a few apples some years, and we always sort of resented him for it. But that year, when he told us where to go, it made us downright hate him. I mean, for the entirety of the next year, me and my brother would scowl whenever my dad drove us past his house. To us, he ruined the one good thing we got to do around Halloween each year. I know we were just dumb kids, but kids are also cruel and stubborn on occasion, and I guess we were just that kind of kid. So the next year, my mom decides to take us over to Living History Farms over in Urbandale. Living History Farms is this place over near Des Moines that bills itself as interactive outdoor museum which teaches people about Midwestern rural life experiences. Obviously, we weren't thrilled about the visit. It wasn't exactly exciting for two boys in their early teens. I mean, learning about some of the origins of Halloween was pretty cool. I mean, a kid like me was all about hearing how Halloween was the night when spirits of the dead returned to Earth to wreak havoc on those that had wronged them in life. However, there was one particular little educational tidbit that got me and my brother's attention, and that was the stories of how our Iowan ancestors used Halloween as a night to play all kinds of pranks on each other. Pulling up cabbages and shrubs out of the garden was a common trick. Wagons were pushed into the lane or the street, or if the kids were feeling ambitious, they'd hoist the cars up on top of the victim's barn roof. But the most common mischief was taking your neighbor's garden or barnyard gates off the hinges and leaving it in someone else's yard. I remember the teacher lady telling us this, then me and my brother just looking at each other with this wordless kind of communication like, oh, the neighbor is going to get it this year. So that year, we snuck out of the house in the early hours of the morning, walked down to the neighbor's place with a screwdriver and hammer, and then did exactly that. We took his front gate off the hinges, walked it like a mile down the road to his other neighbor's place, then left it in the front yard. We did stuff like that for the next couple of years, each time getting progressively more bold, screwing with him harder and harder until it got to the point that we struggled to top the previous year's prank. Like it got to the point where we stole a huge section of his white picket fence and just threw it into the cornfield across the highway. I mean, we put some actual work into that, dismantling it piece by piece so as not to make too much noise and wake the guy. I mean, it sucked that we never got to hang around to see his reaction, but I guess imagining him going outside in the morning and going insane with rage was enough to keep us amused. So this one year, we rocked up to his house in the middle of the night and saw something we'd never expected to see in a million years. The neighbor guy obviously hated Halloween and never ever put up any decorations or anything. But that year, we turned up to see this Grim Reaper figure on his porch. It wasn't just some dumb-looking scarecrow type thing either. It seemed like the guy had put in a lot of work getting hold of an actual mannequin of something, as well as all this spooky-looking black robe stuff to dress it in. But since he was a farmer, he didn't have much trouble getting hold of the old rusty scythe that was leaning up against it. I mean, yeah, it was kind of intimidating. He'd obviously only put it there to try to scare us off, but we weren't about to be put off from our little year ritual at this point. Nothing short of a tornado could deter us from getting our revenge for having been so mean to us that Halloween night. But right as we started to dismantle his fence in almost absolute silence, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Or rather, I noticed the lack of something. So subtle that it actually takes me a minute to realize what I wasn't looking at. At some point, as we were taking his fence apart, the Grim Reaper statue thing had just up and disappeared. I stopped what I'm doing, looking around the front yard and trying to spot where it could have gone. I whisper over to my brother like, "The Reaper's gone. Did you see it move?" And at first he looked at me like I'm crazy. But then he too starts getting pretty freaked out. We're just crouched down, tools in hand, in the dead silence of the night, realizing that we'd been a little bit overconfident in our yearly pranks. I mean, we didn't quite realize what was happening at the time, only that things were about to go horribly wrong for us. "Let's get out of here," my brother whispered, and we immediately get up and start sort of jogging back towards the highway. Then, out of nowhere, the Grim Reaper is just standing there in front of us, with that big old rusty scythe in his hand, blocking our escape. It hadn't been a mannequin that was set up on the neighbor guy's porch. It was actually him. He dressed up like some dumb decoration and just stood there, still as a statue, waiting for the pranksters to arrive. There was like one drawn-out moment where we just sort of locked eyes with the guy who had taken down the hood of the black robes he was wearing, and then we just bolted. But since he was blocking the way to the road out front, we had to run back through his property, climbing over a fence and into a cornfield to get away from him. He was really fast for an older guy, too. Like maybe it was just all that anger from having been victimized year after year, but somehow he wasn't weighed down by that scythe and those robes, which for some reason he'd opted to keep on. Didn't slow him down either. I was scared, sure, but I figured we'd be able to get away, but remember how I said we had to scale a fence to get away? Well, jumping down the other side didn't go too well for me, and I badly sprained my ankle when I landed. That was when I really got terrified, when I realized I couldn't actually get away from the guy. My brother just kept running, and I wanted to shout after him to help me, but I knew the shout would give away my position to the guy, so I just kept my mouth shut. So picture the scene. I'm hiding out in the cornfield, so scared that I'm actually covering my mouth to keep from breathing too heavy, while this furious, scythe-armed guy is stalking up and down the rows looking for me. So every so often, I had to just sort of limp to a hiding spot further away from him, trying my best not to rustle any of the stalks so I wouldn't betray my hiding spot. I mean, thank God it was the middle of the night, and maybe the guy's eyesight or hearing was just failing him in general, but I managed not to get myself caught. I just kept on stumbling further and further away until he just gave up and headed back to his house. But Jesus Christ, it was completely and utterly terrifying, hearing him say all this stuff like, "I'm gonna cut you up into little pieces and feed you to my pigs." Like the voice of his was telling me he meant every word of what he said. So yeah, as you can imagine, I was pretty close to peeing my pants, knowing that I just couldn't get away fast enough. Needless to say, we didn't try any more pranks on that guy after that. I made up some excuse to my parents as to how I'd hurt my ankle and then just used it as an excuse to stay home until it had healed, given that I was super paranoid about the neighbor guy figuring out who exactly had been victimizing him year after year. But yeah, that's my story. I know it's probably not the scariest thing you'd ever heard, and I know that we kind of deserve what we got in the end.
Allow me to explain. I was a senior in high school at the time, and I was definitely not a popular kid. My friends and I were the oddities of the school, the few people who dared to defy the norm. It was them who told me about the deep web, a place on the internet where you are completely unwatched, anonymous, capable of doing whatever you wanted. Of course, I was intrigued. Most of my friends just used it to buy drugs, but I thought a little bit bigger. I wanted to know what happened in the darkest parts of the deep web, whether or not my friends were telling the truth when they talked about horrible fetish sites and assassins you can hire to kill anyone you'd like. Of course, I wasn't planning on using any of it. It was the mystery of it all that fascinated me. Going onto these sites would be like peering into a world only a few have ever seen, like an entirely new experience. At the time, I was tired of the monotony of life. I would get up at the same time every day, go to school, attend the same classes, talk to the same people, go home, play video games, do homework, go to sleep, and then repeat. I wondered if other people got tired of that. Anyway, it took me a while to actually dive into the deep web. As fascinated as I was, I had been warned of what could happen to me. Who isn't afraid of being threatened by hackers or stalked by some creep you pissed off online? That kind of shit kept me from actually going on the deep web. Until the day I manned up and decided that it was time. It was time to delve into the underbelly of the internet. Time to see a world that I'd only ever dreamed of. For the first week or so, it was fucking boring. It was just drug sites and stuff where people exposed government secrets, or whatever. Nothing as dark as I expected. I wasn't really into politics. I don't even do drugs. So that was useless to me. There wasn't really much I was into back then. So I was disappointed. The only reason I kept exploring was my sheer desire to experience the world I thought existed on the deep web. That world was darker than any drug site. That world had murder, torture, and all sorts of nasty shit. I eventually got my wish. The site didn't have a name. I thought it was a broken link for a bit, since it only led me to a black screen. Right before I could click out, however, a chat box opened up on the screen. Someone using the name admin typed in the chat box saying,
"Congratulations. You found the worst place on the fucking net."
I stared at the screen, more bemused than afraid. It took me a moment to type back, "Cool." That's all I said. What else was there to say? "Hey, I'm here to see your finest torture porn." A moment after, the admin replied,
"Ha ha. You want in?"
I hesitated. All those horror stories were flooding back to my head. But it was too late to chicken out now. This is what I came for. Even if I just clicked out at the first sign of danger, I had to see what was there. I had to know. Not allowing myself to stop, I hesitantly typed back, "Yeah." The chat box closed, and I was led directly to what looked like a video, with another chat box next to it. There were around 5 other people there, each eagerly waiting for something. The video was in black and white, and showed a small room. The only thing inside was a wooden chair. After around 5 minutes of waiting, the door to the room opened, and a man was shoved inside. He was blindfolded and only had on a pair of black briefs. He was followed by a woman. She was dressed in all black, and her face was covered by a mask. In an instant, the chat room went wild. I almost closed the window to spare myself, knowing immediately where this was going. But again, I told myself that this was what I wanted. Maybe not the torture, but the window into the very worst parts of the world. The woman pulled a knife from her pocket and cut off the man's blindfold as she shoved him into the chair. He didn't struggle, and once his eyes were visible I could see why. It looked as if he had been drugged. Resisting was impossible. I frowned, glancing to the side. This was fucked up. I knew this was fucked up. My conscience told me to call the cops, or at least click off. But I forced myself to watch. She turned to the camera, pointing the knife at the man's throat. One of the people in the chat typed, "One of the fingers. Cut off one of his fingers." I clenched my hands into fists, taking in a sharp breath. Was this really fucking happening? Was I going to watch this guy get mutilated, as a small crowd of people watched in glee? I felt like throwing up, a feeling that only worsened when the woman nodded, and then turned to the man, grabbing his limp hand and carefully slicing off one of his fingers. Blood spurted from the wound, and the man moaned in pain, but he couldn't fight back. Breathing heavily, I hovered my cursor over the X, planning on getting the fuck out of there. But I didn't. The woman looked unsatisfied, as if she thought the people in the chat could do better. Another person called for her to slice up the man's arm, and she complied. He was bleeding heavily now, clearly in deep pain. But these people were fucking sick. They were cheering her on from the chat, suggesting new and painful tortures for her to inflict. Eventually, I stopped breathing heavily. I stopped feeling sick. Actually, it was starting to grow on me. By the end, the man was on the ground, covered in blood. I watched this for around half a minute. The people in the chat were starting to die down. They inflicted enough pain. They had their fun. Funny, I thought. How it was all over just when I was getting into it. I smirked. How exciting. This was better than any game I could play. Much better than any fucking class I could attend. Better than sitting with a group of fucking nobodies pretending like I cared for a goddamn second about them. This was the world I wanted to see. This was darkness. This was the underbelly. This was reality. Fucking end him. I typed in the chat for the first time. She nodded for the last time, bringing the man to his feet before slowly dragging her blade across his throat, sending more of his blood spurting out. Once it was done, she dropped him, and he fell to the ground, a lifeless husk. The people in the chat started complimenting the torturer, talking about how it had been another good time, starting to set the date for the next showing. On screen, the woman left the room, leaving the corpse behind. Of course, I quickly wrote down the date for the next showing. This was going to be a part of my life now. I was going to be a part of something bigger. I was going to command the death of these people. What a rush. So yeah, I still love the deep web. I'm in college now, and now I'm even more immersed in the deep web. I've seen shit some people would freak out just knowing exists. I finally broke the monotony of life. Isn't it inspirational? How one high schooler defies the inherent boredom of his life by discovering his true passion? I love the deep web. This happened a few years ago. I haven't touched any technology after what happened until now. So I've been using tech since I was a kid. When I was 12, I learned how to write scripts and programs to hack into systems, and ever since, I was hooked. In my second year of university, I was quite good at hacking, albeit somewhat cocky. Throughout high school, I had made a lot of money hacking. People would come to me to recover their hacked social media accounts, or to hack into their boyfriend's phone to read their messages. I was known as the go-to guy if you wanted something hacked. Even my school would occasionally come to me for help. Like I said, I made a lot of money back in those days. Halfway through my second year of university, I started getting bored of this. The money was good, but there was no thrill anymore. One of my friends told me about this cool thing called the dark web. I had heard of the dark web before, but it never really seemed that interesting. My friend told me about how it was full of drugstores, weapons dealers, hackers for hire, and a bunch of fucked up porn sites. As a hacker and a stoner, the dark web seemed right up my alley. When I got home that day, I fired up my computer and did some quick Googling. With my vast knowledge of technology, it didn't take me long to get set up with Tor and Tails installed on my computer. I browsed through the hidden wiki, finding most of the websites boring or dead. I texted my friend asking if he had any interesting link directories. He replied, "Here are a few of the ones I use." He then sent me 5 links. I decided to click on the second one and see what I could find. I scrolled through the directory for a few minutes. He was right about how interesting the dark web was. I couldn't figure out where to start, so I clicked on a chat room. The website looked old and primitive, but surprisingly there was one person online. I started talking to him. He seemed kind of shady, but this was better than just scrolling through a bunch of dead websites. He said he had been on the dark web for a while. Finally finding someone with a vast knowledge of what's on the deep web, I asked him if he had any interesting links. He sent me a link, then immediately left the website. I had no idea what was hidden behind that link. I wish I hadn't clicked on it, but at the time, my own curiosity overwhelmed me, and I clicked on the link without giving it a second thought. After it finally loaded, I was presented with a pop-up box. It said in red text, "If you don't know what's next, you're probably in the wrong place." There were 2 buttons, continue and leave. I instantly clicked continue. Biggest mistake of my life. It brought up a black screen with a blood-red title at the top, The Freak Show. A message popped up.
Hello.
Interesting website you got here.
Thank you. Are you here for the show?
I thought to myself, what show? Out of curiosity, I replied, yes.
Since you are a first-time viewer, it's going to cost you 500 Bitcoin. Future viewings are free.
From all the money I made hacking, I had enough to fuel my curiosity, so I went ahead and paid the $500. After paying him, I was given a zip file instead of a link. I had developed a custom-made antivirus that appeared to work very well, so I took the risk and downloaded it. When I unzipped the folder, there was 2 files inside, an installer and a file named README. I started by opening the text file. It just said,
"Do not send the installer to anyone, or else."
I went ahead and closed the text and opened the installer. It took about 15 minutes to install, which is strange for my computer. After installing, it opened up automatically. Across the screen it said,
"Hello, welcome to the Freak Show. We use custom program for our streams instead of live streaming on tour due to the slow speeds. We also need the extra security."
After about 10 seconds, the screen changed. It was now a countdown, with a chat room next to it. At this point, I was starting to feel that whatever happened next would not be good. The timer displayed that there was 30 minutes until the stream started. I set my screen name to James Kent 157, not my real name, but I needed an alias. I said hi in the chat, but was ignored. I waited the 30 minutes, and after the timer hit 0, a video feed began. On the screen there was a guy in a mask with 3 people side by side in front of him. He started speaking with a voice changer.
"Welcome to the Freak Show. We're happy to see all of our old viewers and a few new ones. We will now randomly choose one of you to tell us who to kill first and how to kill them."
At that point, I realized I was fucked. I was in too much shock to close the window. I watched as the feed turned into a bunch of names scrolling, until it landed on someone named Gore 725. I watched as he typed out his horrific demands, which involved stabbing and dismemberment, and finishing him off with hot metal. I watched as the sicko did all of this. I watched as the victim screamed in pain. After everything was said and done, he said,
"Now, who's next?"
After he said that, I snapped out of it and went to close the page. When I clicked on the X, it said,
"Sorry, no leaving midstream."
I was trapped. The randomizer popped up again, and this time, it landed on my username. I couldn't respond. Instead, I typed in the chat, "You sick fucks. Why are you doing this?" I was met with all the people in the chat calling me names like pussy, dumbass, retard. I then said, "I'm calling the police." That was a big mistake. The owner of the site then said,
"Call the police, and you'll be in the next stream, Logan."
That made my heart freeze. He knew my real name. He then pasted my parents' names, my address, school, age, and IP in the chat. I immediately pulled the plug on my computer, and my screen went black. I then ran to my parents' room and told them what happened. They called the police, and they provided us with protection. Within a few months of investigation, they found the website's owner. He was a 32-year-old man who lived off a combination of welfare and the money he made from his red room. It was many years later before I finally started using technology again. The dark web is an abyss of terrible things, and if you're smart, you'll stay the hell away from it.
The story about the deep web I'm about to tell you is absolutely true, and doing this was probably the worst mistake of my life that I've ever made. Take my advice when I say never go on the deep web or the dark web, as both those places are not only terrifying but sick and cruel. I'll begin my story with a bit of background information. During my first semester of college, I had recently broken up with my first ever real girlfriend. We had a healthy relationship since high school, and we did everything together, and there has only been one minor argument in the 6 years we had been together. The reason for our breakup was because she was moving to another state with her family, which I still forget the reason till this day. Needless to say, over the next few months I was beyond depressed. Every day, I had attended my classes, go home, do homework, and go to my room sobbing in tears. For the next few weeks, it started to become a cycle, and I couldn't help it as I would never be seeing her again, or at least not for a long time. Fast forward a few months later, my depression slowly started to go away, and I started talking to more people and interacting with more friends. One day, I came home extremely depressed as my friends brought up my ex, and I just sort of turned to the internet for a while to try to get her off my mind. I was looking through Reddit to see if I could find something interesting. I'm normally into funny stuff like comedy, and I didn't find anything like that on Reddit. However, I then saw a post about something called the deep web. That post immediately caught my eye and I clicked on it. I'm not going to go into much graphic detail about what the post actually said, but let's just say it said things about the deep web that were surely fake. Or at least I thought. To list some examples, there were apparently drug sites, assassins you could hire to kill people, weird fetish sites, and even documents and files that the government doesn't want the public to see or know about. This seemed like something I'd be interested in. Not the fetish sites or anything like that, but I wanted to see for myself what the actual deep web was all about. It said to download a browser called Tor. They recommended other browsers, but Tor was apparently the best browser to use when going on the deep web. I knew how to install Tor and get everything set up, as I'm good with stuff like that. After a few clicks of getting everything ready, I was now officially on the so-called deep web. I found something called the Hidden Wiki. There was something called editors' picks, volunteers, and something called introduction points, so yeah, nothing too dark. I scrolled down and discovered categories such as drugs, adult content, porn, and Bitcoin. Now I thought that I was actually getting somewhere with this. I clicked on drugs, and to my surprise, there were drug websites, at least 100 of them. Of course I wasn't buying any, as I'm not the type of person to get involved with any illegal activity. After more searching, I found forums that had discussions about where to find torture and illegal pornography. I was shocked and was considering that maybe that post wasn't lying after all. Did this stuff really go on in the darkest parts of the internet? However, curiosity got the best of me, and I stupidly decided to keep searching. Eventually, I found a list of links that led to something. They weren't the usual websites that we're all familiar with, like www or .com or .net. These links were made up of a bunch of random numbers and letters, with each of them ending in .onion. I clicked on one, and it led me to a blank page. At first, I thought it was a broken link, as the page took a good minute to open. As soon as it did, however, it showed another link that was in a red color, with a creepy smiley face next to it. Alarms immediately start going off in my head, and I wanted to click out right then and there, but like I said, curiosity got the best of me once again, and I clicked on the link. You might be thinking that maybe it was just a virus or a hack, but no. What I saw next almost made me puke. I'm not going to name the site, but the site was dedicated to hundreds of photos and even videos of people being tortured, raped, hung, and even whipped. Some of them not even being adults, and you know exactly what I mean by that. Let me just say that I've seen some messed up stuff in my life, from people getting run over to beheadings, but this was beyond that stuff. I would like to mention that I don't mind seeing some dark stuff here and there, but I do have my limits. This was beyond dark and disturbing. I know it sounds hard to believe that stuff like this actually happens, but unfortunately there are some people in this world that are sick in the head who get pleasure out of doing these types of things. I immediately closed down the website and deleted the Tor browser and never went on my computer for a while. I've done more research on the dark web, and a lot of people say that torture and stuff like that don't actually happen, but I'm pretty sure I know more than they do. For those of you who are curious about going on the dark web, please take my advice and don't go there, especially if you don't know what you're doing. I was young and naive and stupid for making that mistake. Don't go on the dark web. This is the story about my experience on not the deep web, not the dark web, but rather what is believed to be the Mariana's Web. For those of you who don't know what the Mariana's Web is, it's basically the darkest place on the internet you could possibly go. Many people claim that the Mariana's Web is a myth and that red rooms and torture doesn't exist, but let me tell you that they are completely wrong. I know this because I used to be a hacker on the deep web. In fact, I was so advanced that I could access files and other things not many people could access. I could hack into streetlights, hack people's bank accounts, government files, and much, much more. I knew it was wrong, but back then I thought I was slick and could get away with practically anything as long as I was careful, and I did for a while. It was the summer of 2018, and one night I decided that it was time to see a part of the internet that very few people have ever seen before. I gathered all of the information and steps to get to the Mariana's Web, which I obviously won't explain, but let's just say that it had a lot to do with coding and encrypting files in order to unlock certain places. A lot of people think that it's easy to get on the dark web with just a Tor browser, but it's much harder than you may think. Sooner or later, I was pretty sure I was now on the so-called Mariana's Web. The first things that popped up were of course some drug sites, and sites that sold stolen credit cards and some messed up fetish sites. Thankfully, I had no interest in that stuff, so I didn't bother paying any attention to that. However, a message then popped up at the top right-hand side of my screen. It said the words, "Hello new user, you have an invitation." I was confused and decided to find out more information, so I stupidly clicked on it. There was a blank white screen with only one link. I could tell from the link that it was a video of some type. Now, I wasn't afraid of getting hacked as my computer was very well protected and anybody who dared to hack me would not be successful at all. I thought I was the tough guy and proceeded to click on the link. It took a while to load, but eventually static appeared on my screen along with a frequency type noise coming from my computer. However, a screen appeared on my computer from some sort of video. The quality was very grainy, but I could just make out the footage to be a living room of some type. It was confirmed that it was indeed a video when a door from the room opened. A man with a creepy mask came out and sat down in one of the chairs. He started to introduce himself as Doug and how he was known to murder people. He then started talking about how he plans out who he's going to murder next and how he always get away with it. Like I said, I've been really experienced with the dark web and it's normal to come across stuff like this. Doug then got up and walked into another room bringing out what looked like a folder of some type. He opened it and showed pictures of all the people he had supposedly killed. However, they weren't just photos of the people themselves. It was photos of people murdered, like stabbed and beat. There was one picture he showed where a woman was being run over with what looked like a truck. He mentioned about how he came up with these creative ways of tormenting these people without having to kill them instantly. He wanted their deaths to be long, suffering, and painful. There was a comment section, and I decided to try something I'd never done before. I typed, "You're such a sick person." Doing that was possibly the biggest mistake I've ever made, because not even 3 seconds later my screen became dark and a small chat box appeared. A message appeared inside the box saying that I was stupid for doing that. I thought that maybe it was some sort of bot trying to scare me, but something inside of me told me that this was no bot and that I was talking to an actual person. I typed back saying, "Who is this?" Whoever it was replied saying that he was Doug. I told him that I was going to report him to the police and show them the video. There was a short pause before he typed back saying, "Oh, really? Well, I guess I'm gonna have to kill you, Jacob." In my mind, I of course thought he was joking, but I was dead wrong when he typed my full, complete address. However, the address was only the tip of the iceberg. He started talking about how he knew everyone I knew. My parents, my relatives, my friends, and even my teachers. I was shook, wondering how in the world he knew every person I knew was. He then typed, "I'll see you later." After that, my computer shut off completely and it wouldn't turn back on no matter how many times I tried. I didn't tell my parents as I would get into major trouble, so I decided to keep quiet and let it die. As more time went on, I thought the whole thing was far behind me. However, it wasn't until a few weeks later that I came home one day to my mom questioning me about something. She said while I was at school, a sketchy-looking man came by the house asking for me. My mom, of course, wasn't stupid and claimed that he had the wrong house. She told me that he tried to convince my mom that he needed to come in, but after my mom kept refusing, he eventually gave up. Till this day, I'm convinced that whoever was at my door that day was Doug. This just goes to show you how one little mistake can almost ruin your entire life. I still wonder what would have happened had my mom not been home.
The scariest night of my entire life was a close encounter with a later confirmed murderer when I was camping with my boyfriend in the mountains. It ended with us running for our lives down the mountain in the pitch black, clutching knives and a hammer for self-protection. It was the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. We were naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible. We walked really far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just got dark. It was twilight. All of a sudden, my boyfriend saw a man approaching us slowly. He was creeping up on us. At first, we thought it was a park ranger, coming to tell us to put out our campfire. I began to hide the weed, thinking this was our biggest concern. My boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird that he didn't have any kind of light on him. She didn't have any camping bag, nothing for camping. Why was he out here so far with no camping gear at night, with no light? He sped up after my boyfriend called out and came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes. The look was absent, blank, and weird. He didn't answer my boyfriend. He just kept walking right at him. Red flags going off at this point. When my boyfriend realized that it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had a concealed knife. He made it clear that he had a weapon. It was only after my boyfriend did this that the guy acknowledged us. He said something weird. "Oh, I was just wondering if y'all were having a party." Remember, we were miles away from a single soul, and it was beginning to get dark when he began to approach us slowly without a flashlight. He had no camping gear with him, just a tiny drawstring bag on his back. After he asked what we were doing, we didn't give him any answers but asked what was going on. He didn't answer. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant that the guy approaching couldn't see how many people were at our site. He asked, "How many people you got with ya?" He began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and my boyfriend didn't answer. He carried on circling around our camp. Now bear in mind, we had set up our camp on this crazy steep hill. It was the only spot for miles that was possible to put a camp. However, he told us that he was going to set up camp nearby. He proceeded to walk off in that direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put a campsite there because of the terrain. Remember, he had no light and no bag with camp gear. Nothing. We were silent. We listened to his footsteps on the leaves as he walked up the hill in the direction completely off the path. He walked for about 30 seconds, and then his footsteps stopped completely. He was just still, silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him. It was dark. At this point, I was freaking out. I didn't want to seem like a baby in front of my boyfriend. We had to talk about whether we needed to leave. My boyfriend handed me a knife and said, if anything happens to me, I should run. At this point, I knew it wasn't just me freaking out unnecessarily. He said that we needed to get out of there and just to grab essential items. I was scared that he was about to shoot us dead. Later on, when I told my boyfriend this, he said no. This is the type of guy who would probably prefer to stab his victims to death. We began to walk, kind of run down the trail in the pitch black with our lights off for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at one point. He ran behind me to protect me. This experience stuck with me. I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason why that guy was out there that night. I've tried. Now this was the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, now husband, and I were remembering it last night. I decided to type in Google if there had been any murders in the same place around the same time. And there was. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner, before stabbing a man to death with a 17-inch knife. A woman he was with ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender, and he began to stab her. Somehow, she managed to get away. The killer carried on wandering the trail, and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight. They didn't, thank goodness. All of these details are the same as the guy who approached us. Same age, same deranged eyes, same lack of flashlight, same time to approach us, same look, same place. The more articles I read, the more I realize this psychopath had been roaming the trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him, not just us. Apparently this erratic and violent psychopath was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Sovereign Jordan. We got lucky. It could have been us.
October 10th, 1999 was just another ordinary Sunday around our house. After the four of us returned from morning services, I helped Erin, my beautiful wife, finish preparing the last few sides for lunch. Just before noon, the children were called to the table, and as usual, a great meal was had. When we were all satisfied, the kids ran off to do their thing, and I assisted Erin in cleaning the table. Once I had completed my husbandly duties, I slipped away to the living room to nap for the few hours. Around 3:45, I was awakened by a phone call from my grandmother, Annie, my dad's mother and the only remaining grandparent or parent on either side of my family. She had raised myself and my sister after our parents had passed, and we were all very close. She asked if I knew any young men that needed work as a repair maintenance man. Her last guy had gotten too old to do the work, and she needed someone new to help around the house every once in a while. I helped her out as much as I could, but between my long hours at work and driving the girls back and forth to their various school-related commitments, I couldn't be relied on to do as much as she sometimes needed. Although I had no one in mind at that very moment, I told her that I'd put the word out and get back to her the next day. My first stop was to Erin. She had nothing for me. A few calls were made to various friends, but they couldn't think of anyone. However, they promised to get back with if the situation was to change. It was a waiting game now, so I plopped myself back down in the chair and dozed off again. A knock came at the door just as I began to drift off. The interruption annoyed me, and for a second I considered not answering it. I decided to go ahead, if just to stop them from banging on the door. When I opened it, I was met by a smiling young man holding business cards. He asked if I needed him to mow the yard. I declined his offer, but just then, Grandmother Annie's request popped into my mind. He was about to walk away until I caught him and asked him if he could do basic repairs, things like fixing broken garbage disposals. When I asked this, his eyes lit up and he said yes. In fact, he had been a Mr. Fix-It in his last job, but unfortunately there was not enough work, so he was forced to fall back on lawn mowing to make ends meet. I briefly looked him over and thought about it in my head for a moment. He seemed like a nice, well-mannered kid. He said thank you, which is more than you can say about most people these days. Finally, I told him to give me a card. I might have a steady job for him. He did, and I promised to let him know in the morning. I let him go, and I returned to the house to enjoy my lazy afternoon. The next morning, I called Miss Annie, my family's name for her, to let her know I may have somebody, and I'd be sending him over that morning. When I hung up with her, I called the young man, Mark, and gave him the address. I told him he'd be doing small repairs and maintenance around my grandmother's house. At the end of each week, he was to come over to my place and I'd pay him. Once the specifics were nailed down, he thanked me and went on his way. With that out of the way, I focused on the task in front of me and put everything else out of my mind. When I returned home that day, I rang Miss Annie up to see how Mark had done. Her report of his work was encouraging. She spoke on more than one occasion of how eager he was to do well and his great attention to detail. This news was very pleasing to hear and assured me I'd made the right decision. Life would continue as normal. That Friday, Mark showed up at 6 p.m. to get his money and thank me, once again, for the opportunity. Dinner was just moments from hitting the table, so I had to cut our talk short. I told him to come around about the same time next week, and he took off, with what I assumed was a song in his heart and a smile on his face. This routine would repeat itself for the next several months. However, as time went by, Mark's smile would fade, and his appreciation seemed to become more of an attitude of entitlement. He got to the point where he wouldn't even say thank you, or anything for that matter, to me. He'd just snatch the money from my hand and walk away. While this behavior ticked me off, I didn't have to like him, as long as he did his job. I hadn't talked to Miss Annie for a while, so one Monday morning I gave her a ring to see how things were going. She said all was well, but I could tell from her voice something was bothering her. After a few minutes of coaxing, she admitted that Mark hadn't been doing his job as well as he had at first. Once a month or so had passed, he began making comments about money and not getting enough work. Since I was the one paying him, she had no idea how much he was making, so she said nothing. I assured her I was paying him plenty, enough money for a full-time employee, as a matter of fact. He had no reason to complain. When she mentioned he would get angry toward her and it scared her, I became a little concerned. Just to calm her fears, I told her I would talk to him that Friday. Even after we hung up with one another, her remark about being scared continued to eat at me. Miss Annie was very special to me, and the idea of her being afraid made me mad. I was determined to nip his behavior in the bud, but it became a problem, but I had to make sure I did so with a clear and calm head. Anger would only serve to exacerbate the situation and breed bitterness between us. I'd cooled off by the time Friday came around. In fact, I was in a pretty good mood. Spring was just beginning to rear its head, and I was looking forward to more sunny and warm days. Mark arrived at the usual time and had the now common scowl across his face. He attempted to snatch the cash from my hand, but before he could, I stopped him and said we needed to talk. He said nothing as I spoke, just stared with an annoyed look. I finished and asked if we had a problem between us and made sure to express how serious I was. All he could say was no and assured me we were cool before he slowly reached out for the money and pulled it from my hand. This time, he at least said thank you before walking away quickly. I couldn't be positive, but things seemed to be clearer, if not better. I wouldn't know for sure until I spoke to Miss Annie that Monday, but I felt optimistic about it. Things at work were very hectic that Monday, so I wasn't able to call Miss Annie until later in the day. Strangely, I got no answer, but figured she was out or busy and I could try again later. Work got busy again, and it was not until I clocked out that I could call her back. Once again, no answer came, but I decided to let it go until the next day. Tuesday morning was much quieter around the office. I had plenty of time to make a call. For the third time, she didn't answer. Now I was becoming scared. So I contacted the police and asked if they could do a wellness check. Miss Annie was almost 80 by then, and the chance of falls were high in people that age. I was told they would and to call back in a few hours. However, it was they who called me back. The tone of the officer's voice uneased me, and he seemed to be dragging out things. This made me mad. I was already on edge from worry. Although I'm not proud of it now, at the time it was understandable. I yelled at him to spit it out, so he did just that. They had done the wellness and found Miss Annie dead. This was unexpected but not shocking. Assuming she died of a heart attack, I asked what the causes were. When he told me that she had been murdered, I blanked out for a minute. Never in my wildest fears had I expected to hear those words. He had to yell out a few more times before I responded, and even then, I felt like I was in a fog. This stuck with me for about an hour, but once I had to tell my family the news, the weight of it knocked me back into reality. The only information the officer could give me at the time was that she appeared to have been attacked by one or more people with hammers or blunt objects. If I would have had my wits about me then, the second I heard the word hammer, I could have told him who it was. But that didn't turn out to be required. I give the cop credit for being kind with his words, even after I'd screamed at him. He could tell from my hemming and hawing what I wanted to ask, and assured me that there were no signs that she had been messed with, if you catch my drift. and I thanked him later for this. The rest of the family took the news almost as hard as I did. Miss Annie had become like a second mother to my wife, and my kids loved her greatly. We'd become very dependent on her after we relocated here, and the thought of her not being around was agonizing. It took a day or two before I remembered Mark and gave him a call. I didn't answer, but after I left a message to contact me ASAP. The longer I thought about it, however, it struck me as odd that he hadn't called me. The first day he received no answer at the door,